Welcome to the Unreal Podcast with your host, Darren Lindley. In the Unreal Podcast, we tell true and amazing stories that will change your life. Over the last 15 years, we've surveyed more than 100,000 people and written more than 240 books filled with remarkable, hope-inspiring stories. Listen each week as we bring you another incredible story. The Unreal Podcast is brought to you by booksbehindbars.net, a ministry dedicated to bringing the gospel to prisoners across America. Today's podcast is extremely touching to me. Dwayne and Janet Deskins are close friends of mine. I remember clearly this horrible time in their lives and their stunning loss. One of the most important things that Jesus ever said was, "In the world you will have trouble, but fear not, I have overcome the world." Janet and Dwayne certainly have faced one of the most traumatic moments life can offer, but I am so happy to tell you that even in the darkest moments, Jesus is so much bigger. Can you survive the most horrible things that can happen to a human? Learn how Janet not only survives, but comes back to thrive. I must warn you, this story contains some deeply violent moments. If this would cause you emotional harm, please move on to the next episode in the podcast. The story was written by a friend of mine, Peggy Thompson. I owe Peggy a lot. She was our very first outside writer, and you will see in the story that Peggy has a powerful gift. A fun fact about Peggy is that she is the niece of the mega author James A. Michener. He was one of the most popular authors in America for nearly half a century. Peggy, thank you for the incredible work you did in this story. Now, let's get into Untying the Cord, the story of Janet Deskins, written by Peggy Thompson and read by Tammy Lindley.
Untying the Cord, the story of Janet Deskins. Beloved, his voice bellowed throughout the church, remember this: Jesus took your place on the cross. With his right arm extended, forefinger pointing dramatically at the congregation, Pastor Dunn removed a handkerchief from his pants pocket with his other hand and mopped the perspiration from his brow. It was so quiet in the church you could have heard a pin drop. He paused to let the message sink in and then said, "Please stand for the blessing." He left the platform to make his way to the front of the church. Glancing at his watch, he knew he was going to have to hurry. He had been asked to work tonight for Moss Davis, and they needed to get home as soon as possible so he could change his clothes and get to the mine. After making as gracious a departure as possible, Ollie hurried his wife into the car and sped home. "I'm never going to get used to you working in that mine," Julia said. He reached over and patted her hand. "You're even afraid of mice," he teased with a little smile. He looked over at her and grinned. "Think you're pretty funny, huh?" Ollie reached over and took her tiny hand in his big, strong one. "Come on, honey, remember? I watched the rats. They're as big as German shepherds. If they start heading for the surface, it's time for us men to hightail it out of there." She turned her head to look out the car window. She was afraid. She was always afraid. Ollie was the lead of a 4-man team and a roof bolter. He was a man who worked in darkness, under dangerous conditions. She hated to see his black face and dirty clothes when he came home. She thought about all the coal dust that he breathed. It was a daily reminder for her to pray that God would protect him and not let anything bad happen to him in the mine. After a quick change of clothes, he called out, "Where's my girl? Linda, come give Daddy a kiss. I have to go to work." His little daughter ran into his arms, and he swung her up in the air like he always did before going to work. She giggled and wrapped her arms around his neck. "Why are you going to the mine at night, Daddy?" "Well, a friend of mine got sick, and I'm going to work for him tonight. He mussed her curls with his hand, kissed her on the tip of her nose, and put her down. He kissed his wife. "I'll see you guys in the morning." He was out the door and gone. Gone into the night. Gone into the darkness. As he neared the mine, Ollie pulled into a secondary lane of gravel over cracked asphalt that followed the contours of a low-lying hill. Directly ahead of him, a locked gate barred access to the property with its no trespassing signs. Because he was a lead, Ollie had a key. He turned it in the lock and pushed the sagging gate aside. After he pulled through, he had to get out and lock the gate after him. The pickup lurched and banged as he drove up the deeply rutted gravel road. He parked on the gravel berm and got out. The other 3 men were already in the mine, just inside the entrance. "Hey, Larry," he said while clapping him on the shoulder. "I didn't know you would be on tonight." He stuck his hand out to Jason. "Nice to see you again, man." Turning to Calvin, he said, "You must be the new kid on the block." Calvin's face flushed a bit, and Ollie laughed and shook his hand. "Let's go," Jason said, and they entered the tunnel. About 40 minutes into their work, Ollie thought he heard a muffled rumbling sound, a little bit like faraway thunder. He raised his arm, and all the workers immediately stopped. "You guys step back a bit," he said. He went forward a few feet, and then he heard the sound again. It was a little louder this time. His stomach knotted with tension. Without a moment's hesitation, he said, "You guys get out of here! Now! Run!" Larry and Jason took off. They knew better than to question Ollie. Calvin was out to prove himself, and he wanted to stay. "Hey, Ollie, what can I—" There was a tremendous ear-splitting noise, and Calvin saw Ollie with both arms above his head, pressing with all his strength against the roof of the mine. His knees were buckling against the weight, and he screamed at Calvin, "Go!" Bits and pieces of the roof started falling, and Calvin turned and ran for his life. Glancing back over his shoulder, he saw a huge boulder break free from the roof. It came crashing down, right on Ollie. When they dug his body out, they found his pocket Bible on him. They gave it to his wife. It was spattered with his blood. "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." John 15:13. I don't know what made me think about Grandpa's story that night, but I found myself sitting in his old rocking chair in the quiet of our family room. His pocket Bible was open in my lap. I was vaguely aware that I had picked it up off the small table by the chair. My mother had been to our house a couple days ago, and she must have left it there. She liked having the small Bible with her. Running my fingers lightly over some of the old, brown blood spatter, a wave of tremendous heaviness and sorrow washed over me. Dwayne entered the den, sat on the edge of the couch, leaned forward with his hands clasped between his knees, and looked at me. "Honey?" Raising my head, I let out a sigh. "Dwayne, I don't know what was going on during the church service tonight, but it was weird. Did you notice anything?" "Yes," he nearly whispered. "There was a tremendous heaviness. The whole time I was speaking, I could feel it. Honey, I can still feel that heaviness. It's really bothering me. And another thing bothers me. Mom and I tried to phone each other throughout the day, but every time one of us would call, a customer would walk in, and Mom would have to go. We never got a chance to talk. Marie was on the schedule for the convenience store tonight, but she got sick, so Mom's subbing for her, and I don't want to bother her at work, but I feel kind of empty without having had a conversation with her. We hardly ever miss a day." He got up, walked over to where I was sitting. Offering me his hand, he said, "Come on, let's go to bed. We've had a tough night, and I'm tired. Don't worry about your mom. We would have heard by now if anything was wrong." You're right. I'll just go looking on the girls again before I join you. We walked out of the room together. Dwayne headed to our bedroom, and I quietly pushed open the door to the girls' room and peeked inside. Their faces looked so precious and innocent in the depths of sleep that a lump formed in my throat, and my ears hurt when I swallowed. I gave them each a soft kiss on the cheek and tiptoed out of the room. When I went to our bedroom, Dwayne was already out like a light and snoring. I changed into my nightclothes and eased myself into bed beside him. As I descended into the restorative peace and rest of deep sleep, I glanced at the clock. It was 9:55 p.m. Down at the convenience store, the darkly clothed figure paused by the crack in the fence at the rear of the property. He thought he heard a car engine running, and he peeked through the fence. Then he heard a car door slamming shut and saw a woman walk briskly back into the store. He pushed his way through the fence, listening to the squeaking of the wood. As he walked slowly, cautiously alongside the building, he approached the parked and idling car. He noticed that the ice on the windshield was starting to melt. Must be warming up the engine, he thought. Moving carefully past the car, he stood at the corner of the building. Lurking there in the shadows, he could see the front of the store. He felt his gut contract with anticipation. He loved these nighttime adventures. The door opened, and a woman stepped halfway outside, shaking a rug. As she turned around to go back in, he sprang into action. Moving quickly, he entered the store right behind her and slammed both of his hands into the middle of her back, sending her hurtling. She sprawled, hands flying out instinctively to catch herself. He grabbed her by the hair and pulled her upright. "Please, don't hurt me," she cried out in panic. "Quiet," he snarled. He swung her around, locked his arms around her, pinning her arms against her body, and walked her to the back of the store. Like a hunted animal, his gaze darted this way and that, looking for signs of trouble, any kind of intrusion. He was nervous. Someone could come through the door at any minute. Then he saw a door marked bathroom. Opening it, he shoved her inside into a narrow space between the sink and the stool. She slowly sank to the floor while he fumbled in his pocket and pulled out a gun. "Oh no! Oh, please!" she pleaded. He pointed the gun at her. She started to cry and beg, "Please, please don't shoot me." Her eyes were wide with horror, and she moved her head as if to turn away from the gun that was aimed at her. He fired. The bullet tore into her head, though the blood was slow to come. Her body sagged to the floor. As he turned around to flee, he spotted her purse hanging from a hook on the back of the door and grabbed it. Scrambling to get out of the place, he stopped just long enough to open the till and stuff all the bills from the drawer into his pockets. He ran out the door and was quickly back in the shadows by the car. Opening the car door, he shut off the engine. "I don't think she's going anywhere." Adrenaline was racing through his veins. He was energized. The wind had started to gust in from the ocean. It was a clear, freezing cold night, and the air smelled pungent. He took a deep breath, picking up the faint taste of salt at the back of his throat, and disappeared into the murky darkness of the night. The scream of a gull pierced the air. The shrill ring of the phone beside the bed woke me instantly, and my heart hammered at my ribs as Dwayne clumsily reached out to answer it. He dropped the receiver on the floor, and in what looked like one fluid motion, he got out of bed, switched on the lamp table, and grabbed the receiver. "Hello?" He spoke hurriedly into the phone. The change on his face from sleeplessness to great concern was instantaneous, and a muscle was twitching in his jaw as he said, "We'll be right there." "Who was it?" I asked. now sitting up in bed, fully awake. There was a feeling of dread in the pit of my stomach. He looked at me, took a deep breath, and said, "Jana," that was the chief of police. He said he needs us to come right away to Harbor Hospital. Before he could say another word, I interrupted him. "It's my mom, isn't it?" "Yes. They don't know if she will make it or not." I couldn't speak. We both dressed quickly. It was 11 p.m., and Dwayne's mom volunteered to watch the girls. As we pulled up close to the emergency room, we saw police officers standing beside their car. The scene seemed surreal. We parked and walked over to them. "Are you Jana Deskins?" "Yes, I am." "We're sorry to tell you that your mother has passed away." My body recoiled in shock and grief. I lost contact with the world instantly. I didn't know what was going on, what they were saying, nothing. All I was aware of was an incredible pain, like someone had just thrust a knife into my belly. It kicked in. Great, heaving sobs poured from the depths of my soul. My husband turned me by the shoulders and led me blindly toward a building. The harsh, glaring lights of the ER stabbed at my eyes, and I put both of my trembling hands over my face. One of the doctors came over to us right away. "Are you Linda's relatives?" "Yes," Dwayne answered. "I'm so sorry." "Thank you," Dwayne said. "What happened?" "We're not sure yet. It was most likely a heart attack or a massive stroke. There was a little blood. She might have fallen and hit her head on the sink. We just don't know at the moment." Dwayne led me over to a couch. My dad was sitting there. I remember hearing his voice. He was crying, and his voice was raspy as he spoke with Dwayne. Turning my lifeless gaze toward my father, I leaned back into the safe, warm cocoon of my husband's embrace. All my senses and faculties were out of whack. "I found her," he wailed. "I found her on the bathroom floor in the convenience store. She was dead. Oh my God, Linda is dead." Dwayne was somehow able to get the story out of him. Dad said he had worked all day in the woods and came home exhausted. He knew Mom would be closing the convenience store around 9 p.m. He went to bed and fell asleep, but woke up with a start around 10 p.m. A cold chill ran over me. I just knew something was wrong. I got out of bed, jumped into some clothes, and drove to the convenience store. I ran inside the store, calling for her. "Linda! Linda!" There was no answer. Then I remembered her car was outside, and I went out to check it. The car looked like it had been started because the ice on the windshield had thawed, and the hood felt slightly warm to the touch. I went back into the store. Where was she? She was still here somewhere. I tore through the place. I looked in the bathroom. That's where I found her. He covered his face with his hands, laid his head back against the couch, and sobbed. I went ballistic. I was so crazy I couldn't even find a telephone in the place to call 911, so I ran out of the store and all the way to the police department.
Oh my, this dark moment has happened far too many times. Maybe it's happened to you. I hope you'll stay with us and hear the remarkable work that Jesus is about to do in this story. We're going to get back to the story shortly, but before we do, I want to tell you about an exciting opportunity to bring the gospel to a group of people who are waiting and desperate to receive the transforming work of Jesus. I'm talking about America's prisoners. The Unreal podcast is supported by booksbehindbars.net. This ministry takes the very books the stories you hear on the Unreal podcast come from and sends them to prisons. These books do incredible things in prison. First, when a prisoner sits down to read a book, he or she is saturated for 5 hours with riveting testimonies of Jesus' amazing power to heal, save, and transform. Then, he trades this book for another one of our books. You see, when we send these books to prison, we send many, many different titles so that the prisoners can trade them for other books we've sent in. The result is that when you send a book to prison, it gets read up to 100 times before it finally disintegrates. That means each book produces about 500 hours of evangelism. That is only 2 cents per hour. What if you could bring the gospel to these inmates for 2 cents per hour? Well, the good news is this: you can. When you sponsor one book a month for $10 per month, we send a book in, and it does exactly that. To get involved, simply go to booksbehindbars.net and click on the donate button. And until December 31st, 2019, we have a very generous donor who has promised to match every gift of 5 books per month or more for the life of that donation. That means if you sponsor 5 books a month for the next 5 years, he will match your donation for that entire 5 years. If you sponsor for 10 years, he'll match it for the entire 10 years. This donor is dedicated to seeing the Unreal podcast and booksbehindbars.net really take off as we're launching. Please get involved today. Now, let's get back to Jana's amazing story and the powerful work Jesus does in her life.
When we finally dragged ourselves to our car, it was very late, and yet it felt to me like time had just stood still. I felt detached from the world. I remember telling Dwayne, "It's kind of like an astronaut out in space. He leaves the spaceship attached to the umbilical cord, tethers it out, and floats further and further away. Suddenly, the cord breaks, and he's no longer attached. Now he's free-floating, drifting off into nothingness. He's no longer attached to his roots. My mother brought me into this world. She was my root, my sense of connectedness from the day I was born. Now she's gone. The cord's been cut for a final time." On the way home, we talked more about my mother and her great desire for us to pastor our church. About 2 weeks before her death, God spoke to Dwayne in prayer and said, "Within 30 days you will be the pastor of this church." She would never know whether or not her dream for us came true. "Dwayne, let's stop by the convenience store and get my mom's purse." "Okay, honey, sure." When we got to the store, we were met by a police officer. "Can I help you?" the officer asked. "I came to pick up my mom's purse." "What purse? We didn't find any purse." "Her purse was full of money. She had just made her Avon collections." For some reason, I felt compelled to explain. "My mother's been selling Avon for a long time. She sold it all over the Willapa Harbor community." I felt Dwayne's light touch on my elbow. "Let's go home, Jana. There's nothing we can do about this. Let's leave it to the police, honey." Settling myself into the car, I was so confused. "Dwayne, what could have happened to her purse? There's something very wrong about this." "Yes, there is, but right now, we need to concentrate on the girls. Heather and Jen will have to be told about your mom in the morning." When we got home, I was dizzy with fatigue, shock, and grief. My mind was going a mile a minute, and there was no way I could shut it down. So I went to bed, and I took a sleeping pill. When I finally woke up Thursday morning and walked into the kitchen, both girls ran to me, sobbing, clutching my robe. I didn't realize Dwayne had told them. He was at the kitchen sink making coffee. The nutty aroma tugged at my heart as I realized I would never again have coffee with my mom. I sat down on a kitchen chair, an arm wrapped around each of the girls. We cried together. Heather was devastated. She and my mom were very close. They were a lot alike. I tried to comfort them. We talked a bit about what death means, and I reminded the girls that Grandma was now in heaven with Jesus. Dwayne sat down with a steaming cup of coffee and put a mug in front of me. I called my mom and asked if she could come stay with the girls. "Are we going to school today?" Heather asked. Dwayne reached for her, pulled her to him. "No, Heather, no school today. Would you like some breakfast?" "I'm not hungry." She put her head on his shoulder, where she continued to cry softly. Heather had enough maturity to understand things. Jen, 9 years old and 2.5 years younger than Heather, wasn't able to totally understand what had happened to my mom. She couldn't quite grasp it. I think she cried mostly because Heather and the rest of us did. She said, "I'll have some cereal, Dad," and wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her pajamas. When Dwayne's mom got to our house, we went to the home of my dad's sister. Uncle Jim and Aunt Helen's home was the family gathering place. My Uncle Bill, my dad's brother, and his wife Danielle drove up from Woodland. My brothers Darren and David had come over. A lot of family gathered there that day. We shared our grief and spoke in quiet, somber voices. The heaviness of the emotion hung over all of us like a huge, dark cloud. We were all wrapped together in the cloak of despair and shock. My brother David spoke up. "I don't get it. I heard they were going to do an autopsy. Why do they have to do that?" Dwayne responded, "The doctor said it was natural causes, but they haven't been able to pinpoint exactly what. It looked to them like she had some bleeding from her ear. It might have been a heart attack. She also could have fallen and hit her head on the bathroom sink." "We're supposed to go to the mortuary tomorrow and make arrangements," I said, as I stared blankly into space. "Honey, let me take care of that for you. Just let me know what you want. You need to get some rest." Uncle Bill spoke up. "I'll go with you, Dwayne." "So will I. I would like to be with you, Dwayne, if it's okay," David added. "Sure. The 3 of us can handle it. What do you think, sweetheart?" "That's fine." "Who's doing the autopsy, Dwayne?" Aunt Helen asked. "When are they going to do it?" "One of the best. Dr. Brady is supposed to be up from Portland today." "When will they have the results? When will we know?" I asked with some apprehension. Just the thought of them doing an autopsy on Mom tore at my heart. "I don't know, honey. I guess the doctor will call." Somehow the day passed and Friday came. I stayed at Aunt Helen's house, and Uncle Bill, David, and Dwayne went to the mortuary. They had a 2 p.m. appointment with the doctor, Daryl Stoller. When Dwayne, Bill, and David came home from the mortuary, I knew something was up. My brother is a big guy, 6'5", about 250 pounds. There was rage written all over his face, and his eyes were like fiery orbs. The family was gathered in the family room. Chips and dip were spread out on a table, and a few people were nibbling. I was sipping a Diet Pepsi, but couldn't eat a thing. Dwayne came right over to where I was sitting and leaned down so he could speak softly into my ear. "I need to talk to you, Jenna. Let's go in the other room." He offered his hand and helped me as I rose from the sofa. He continued to hold my hand, and we walked out of the room. He seemed very uptight. We stood just outside the family room in the hallway. Dwayne put his hands on my shoulders and gazed into my eyes. "Honey, I wish there was some way I could make this easier for you." "What? What happened?" "There is difficult news about your mom." Teetering on the edge of hysteria, I exclaimed, "How could there be any more difficult news? She's dead." I stifled a cry by shoving my fist up to my mouth. "Jana, she was murdered." It just hung there in the air. Murdered. The word had a tremendous impact on me. Murder was something you read about in the newspapers. Murder didn't happen to your mother. A flood of words poured out of Dwayne's mouth. It was like he had gotten that word out and felt compelled to drown it by the gush of all the other words to follow. She was shot in the back of the head with a .22 caliber gun. It wasn't noticed right away because she has, well, she had such thick hair, like yours, sweetheart. And there wasn't much blood at the scene. Daryl Stoller told us at the mortuary. Dr. Brady knew that when the EMTs did CPR, blood appeared, and the same thing happened in the emergency room. He said when that happens, you usually suspect a hole somewhere. Somehow it was missed, honey. I wanted to tell you before the whole family found out. I stood there trying to understand what he was saying. He kept talking. For a while there, I was really worried about David. When Stoller came into the room and told us, it was total shock. Then David went into a rage and it frightened me. I thought he might lose control of himself, so I prayed and asked God to help David hang in there. Bill chimed in with some good questions that seemed to divert David. He asked if we knew how this happened, if there were any suspects, that kind of stuff. Apparently, there weren't any cameras in the convenience store, so they don't even have any tapes to look at. Actually, I was very surprised that we got this news from Daryl. He really didn't have any answers and referred us to the police. My eyes were glazed and my body shook. Dwayne drew me to him and wrapped me in his arms. Softly he spoke into my ear. His strength is perfect when ours is gone. It was a reference to one of my favorite CDs that I played all the time. A short time later, Police Chief Jerry Ashley called the house. He was a good friend of both Mom and Dad. Of course you realize that I will now postpone my retirement, Jana. I won't rest until this thing is solved. God bless you, Jerry. That means a lot. And I think I have a suspect. I inhaled sharply and held my breath for a couple of seconds. To know who did this, to find out quickly, might help us somehow deal with this horror. He continued, "The guy I have in mind broke into another man's house and stole all of his guns, 5 in total. We have already found 4 of them, but a .22 caliber is still missing. He took them out of the safe. I'm trying to pursue him to come in for a lie detector test sometime next week." The police seemed to know quite a bit about this man. He had spent most of his life in trouble with the law and was suspected in another convenience store robbery and murder in Alaska. On the Saturday after the murder, we attended a scheduled board meeting at church. Near the end of the meeting, the pastor surprisingly announced his retirement. We were asked to take his place. The installation was to take place on February 8th. Dwayne and I just looked at each other. We were both thinking the same thing. Mom's wish just came true. We held Mother's funeral the following Monday. It was at our small church on Elm. There was overflow attendance. The whole community really loved Mom. It was pouring down rain, and there were rows of people with umbrellas standing, waiting to get inside the church. The funeral service was a complete blur for me. It was time for the healing process. We needed to get on with our lives, but I knew mine would never be the same. I was afraid. We used to keep our doors unlocked, but now I locked them all the time. I was afraid of an intruder. Sounds at night freaked me out. I was a recluse. I didn't go out. I just didn't want to be around people. One day, Dwayne called. "Hi, Jana. I'm on my cell. I'm almost at our front door to pick you up for lunch." "No, I don't think so, honey. I really appreciate you thinking about me, but..." "No buts. You need to get out. Have a change of scenery. I'm pulling into the driveway right now." I pulled the curtain at the window aside and glanced out at the driveway. There he was. Grabbing my purse and sweater, I went out the door to meet him. I slid into the passenger seat. He backed the car out of the driveway and took off. "Just lean back and relax, Jana." As we took off for Dairy Queen, a drifting fog had curled around the landscape, wispy and pale. We drove along the beach, and I stared at the ocean, as it came into view, watching it recede into the mist. The parking lot was generous, and Dwayne found a spot without difficulty. We walked across the lot and pushed through the glass doors. As we entered, a big woman with blonde hair and a fat purse bumped into me and stopped. She just stared. My heart skipped a beat. It was obvious that she had recognized me from either the newspapers or TV. She returned to the moment. "Excuse me," she continued at the door. Dwayne took me by the hand. "Why don't you go pick out a seat for us, Jana, and I'll order. I'm having a number 1. What would you like?" Glancing at the menu board, I mumbled, "A number 1 would be fine." As inconspicuously as possible, I found an empty booth, sat down, and slid over next to the window, as far away from people as I could get. I didn't want to attract any attention to myself. Dwayne came and sat down. He had napkins, plastic utensils, and condiments, and busied himself dividing them up between us. Following closely on his heels, the waitress appeared with her tray. "Here we go," she said, as she placed a small box with a burger and fries and a large Diet Pepsi before each of us. I looked at the greasy food and felt my stomach turn over. Dwayne squirted ketchup in the little paper bag that contained his fries and began dunking them like little worms in the red stuff. "How's it going, Jana?" he asked, his mouth full of a big bite of burger. Picking up a French fry, I nibbled half-heartedly at it. "So-so, Dwayne." I felt obligated to eat and engage in conversation, and I resented being in that position. It seemed there was some kind of spotlight on me. As I sneaked small glances around the room, some people were staring and pointing at me. I heard one say, "She's the one." The urge to get up and run out of the place was strong, but I didn't want to offend my husband. I had to try. We continued making small talk, while I just picked at my food. Dwayne swallowed his last bite and asked, "Are you ready?" "I have to get back to work, I'm afraid." Relief washed over me. "Sure, you bet." Once back in the car, I turned toward Dwayne and said, "I'm sorry, honey. I haven't been eating much these days, but you're wonderful, and I appreciate your thoughtfulness." He glanced over at me and gave me a soft smile. "I understand, Jana. Not to worry." After Mom's death, my dad moved in with my brother. My mom had done everything for him. Without her, it was difficult for him to get back to doing everything himself. It was tough for both of us. He was hurting. I was hurting. One day, Dwayne and I were over there, and he said he wanted to tell us something. We both sat down beside him on the couch. "I meant to tell you about this before." His voice was shaky, sort of weak. 2 weeks to the day before your mom died, I had a dream. It was very vivid. Tears squeezed out of the corner of his eyes. Actually, I had it twice. It was so real that I thought it was really happening. He paused to wipe the tears with the back of his hand. I dreamed that Linda was on a plane, and the plane went down. I was running frantically through the wreckage trying to find her, but I never did. Why in the world would I dream something like that? I believe God was trying to prepare you for Mom's death, Dad. He was trying to soften the blow. The Lord does things like that to help us, Dwayne said to my father. "It didn't work," Dad replied bitterly. A few months later, we planned a revival at the church and invited an evangelist, Darren Lindley, to speak. He preached about forgiveness. Forgiveness is not the absence of pain, and it's not the absolution of consequences. Forgiveness is when we release someone from our judgment. After the sermon, he offered an invitation to individuals feeling the need to forgive to come to the altar. A feeling of compelling urgency swept over me. It was so strong that I went down the aisle to the altar. We were asked to pretend that the person who had hurt us was standing in front of us. When we pretended, a cord was wrapped around that person, and Darren asked us to go through the physical motions of untying that bond. As we did, we had to repeat after him. "In the name of Jesus Christ, This bond represents my judgment over you, and in Jesus' name I now set you free from my judgment, and I throw it into the sea of God's forgetfulness." With a tremendous effort, I put a face on my mother's killer and pretended he was there and bound to me with that cord. I didn't want to release him. I tried to reject the idea of forgiveness. It was a terrible struggle for me. As I started to untie the bond from the killer, I felt a warm, gentle feeling start to flow throughout my entire body. "You can do this, Jana. I want you to do this." A feeling of relief overcame me as I continued to unbind the killer. When I was finished, I felt the beautiful grace of our Lord and His approval, and I actually felt serene as the weight of my burden of judgment was lifted from my spirit. Darren told me later that when I approached the altar, he saw severe pain on my face. After I untied the cord, he said my countenance changed immediately and my face shone with peace. It was at that moment the Lord started working in my spirit. I knew God would take care of this, and all that stuff was off of me. Another amazing thing happened that night. Heather's heart was in deep pain. She was curled up in the fetal position, partway under a pew, sobbing just like the day she found out about her grandma. She was down there for about an hour. The Lord put peace in Heather, and she told us later of feeling the warmth of the healing passing through her body. Also, a gift had been bestowed upon her. Heather acquired a singing voice. Prior to that night, she had not been gifted in this, but she sure has it now. God put a song in that girl's heart, and she's a totally different person. But the people of God will sing a song of joy like the songs at the holy festivals. Isaiah 30:29. That experience changed my heart about everything and people in general. My mother was a woman full of life, and she was very happy. It would grieve her if I were to live a sad life, and I knew I couldn't do that to her. The girls needed me to be able to go on in a positive way as well. I received grace to do that. God has given us a vision to one day have a house for women. It will be for addiction recovery. We're going to call it Linda's Place, and we will honor Mother's memory. We found out a little later that the suspect was caught. The police had enough evidence to get him convicted of the gun theft, and he spent some time in the penitentiary. When he got out, he attacked a couple on a nature trail in Grisham. He killed one of them and wounded another. The police arrived on the scene, and he shot an officer. While he was in prison awaiting trial, Chief Jerry kept trying to talk to him about Mom's murder. He had a lot of circumstantial information, but no real evidence. One day, they found him in his cell. He had hung himself. Now, whenever I thumb through Grandpa's pocket Bible, I think about how he died in another man's place. Then I think about my mother, his daughter, who died in another woman's place. Then I think about Jesus, who died for all of us on the cross, the ultimate sacrifice. Those who live in the shelter of the Most High will find rest in the shadow of the Almighty. This I declare of the Lord. He alone is my refuge, my place of safety. He is my God, and I am trusting Him. For He will rescue you from every trap and protect you from the fatal plague. He will shield you with His wings. He will shelter you with His feathers. His faithful promises are your armor and protection. Do not be afraid of the terrors of the night, nor fear the dangers of the day, nor dread the plague that stalks in darkness, nor the disaster that strikes at midday. Psalm 91, 1-6.
Isn't that just incredible? I remember so clearly that service that Jana speaks about in the story. I watched the truly incredible healing that Jesus brought to her. Literally, that transformation was overnight. Her countenance changed from someone who was tortured to a person who was healed by the power of God. She went from being dark and depressed to light and happy. It was truly one of the most incredible and complete healings I have ever seen. I would like to share with you the very message I preached that night on the booksbehindbars.net website. If you have a need to forgive the unforgivable, this message will be a huge thing for you. Go now to booksbehindbars.net and click on the Unreal podcast link. I will have the link to that video right below this story. Now, I want to pray for you. Jesus, would you come in this moment? I am sure there are people for whom this story has stirred up some very dark memories. I thank you that you are the God who does not want us to wallow forever in our wounds and sorrow. No, you desire to bring real and complete healing. Jesus, please set the captive free from the bitterness and anger that Satan desires to rule their lives with. Do your work now, Jesus. In your beautiful name I pray. Amen. Please make sure you go to booksbehindbars.net and listen to this message. Jesus wants to heal your broken heart. Would you please help us reach many more people by sharing this podcast with your friends? We know that there is such power in the testimony of Jesus changing lives. Let's share these stories with everyone we know. We look forward to seeing you next week on the Unreal Podcast.